When your ankles swell up 3 times the size they were before, that means heart failure. And he does look sick. And he does babble and, sound like the brain's not doing too hot. And so we just cut bait on Trump, and we just mobilize against the Democrats. This is not funny. This is not good. But he's gone. And that's it.
That was not a Democrat. That was not a mainstream media anchor. That was not a progressive commentator with an agenda. That was Alex Jones. The same Alex Jones who spent years building the movement that put Donald Trump in the White House. The same Alex Jones who had defended him through every controversy, every accusation, every moment where the rest of the world turned away. That was the voice of the loyalist. And that loyalist had finally said enough. Pay close attention to what comes next. Because what happened in the weeks that followed was not a political story. It was something older and more human than that. It was the story of what happens when people who believed in something realize they have been lied to, and what it costs, and what they do when the cost becomes too high to keep paying. The number that started it all was not a poll number. It was 13. 13 American service members. 13 people who had enlisted, trained, deployed, and died in a war that their commander-in-chief had promised them would never happen. A war that Donald Trump had stood in front of cameras and told the American people he would never start. No more endless wars. No more American blood spilled in the Middle East on behalf of foreign interests. That was the promise. 13 flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover Air Force Base was the answer. And then Donald Trump went to Dover. He stood with the families. He looked at the parents and the spouses and the children of the dead, and he told them that their loved ones had wanted it, that every single one of them, without exception, had asked him personally to finish the job, to keep going, to send more soldiers into the war that had already taken their fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, every one of them. That is what he said. Joe Kent heard it. Joe Kent, the Green Beret who had served 11 combat tours, who had lost his own wife to war, who had resigned from the highest counterterrorism position in the United States government because he could not in good conscience continue. He heard the President of the United States stand at Dover Air Force Base and use 13 dead soldiers as justification for sending more soldiers to die. And he responded with 5 words that cut through every talking point and every press briefing and every carefully managed narrative the administration had constructed. We do not honor our fallen by getting more of our best men and women killed in the Middle East. 5 words. From a man who had given more to this country than anyone in that briefing room would ever be asked to give. 5 words that the cable networks did not lead with. 5 words that disappeared inside the noise of a news cycle that had already moved on to the next statement, the next approval rating, the next carefully worded denial. But the approval ratings were moving, and they were not moving in a direction the administration could ignore. 93%. That is where Donald Trump stood with his own 2024 voters at the start of his second term. 93% of the people who had pulled the lever for him, who had believed the promises, who had trusted that this time would be different, approved of the job he was doing. That number felt like a foundation. It felt like proof that the base was solid, that whatever came next, the loyalists would hold. Then the war started, and the number started moving. 84%, then 76%. The pollsters and the pundits said it was still within manageable range, that the core MAGA base was holding, that the people who mattered were still with him. But the methodology of those polls contained a quiet truth that no one wanted to say out loud. The people who had already left were no longer being counted as MAGA. They had stopped identifying that way. They had walked away quietly, without a press conference, without a viral moment, without a headline. They had simply stopped believing and moved on. And the polls were measuring the people who remained, not the people who had already gone. Harry Enton put a number on it, not a political number, a historical one. Donald Trump now had the worst net approval rating among independents of any president ever at this point in a second term, worse than Richard Nixon, worse than George W. Bush, worse than every president who had come before him and faced the judgment of a country that had started to turn. Minus 18 points, from plus 6 at the start, in 5 weeks of war. And still the Loyalists were being asked to hold. Still the television hosts who had built careers on defending him were being asked to find the words. Still the influencers who had posted and shared and amplified every message for years were being told that this was different, that this war was necessary, that the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear threat and the American interests in the region justified what was happening, that the 13 dead soldiers had not died for nothing, that their families, standing at Dover in the cold, had told the president personally that they wanted it to continue. Alex Jones stopped holding. And when Alex Jones stopped holding, he did not do it quietly. He did not issue a measured statement. He did not sit down with a friendly interviewer and carefully walk back his support with diplomatic language designed to protect future relationships. He went on air, in front of his own audience. The same audience he had spent years telling to trust the movement, to hold the line, to believe that Donald Trump was the one man in American politics who would not betray them. And he told them the opposite of everything he had said before. He said the president had lost his mind, not as a metaphor, as a diagnosis. He described a man who had surrounded himself with people whose loyalty was not to America, but to a foreign government, who had isolated himself from any voice willing to deliver bad news, who had stopped listening to anyone except the television hosts who told him what he wanted to hear. He said the president sat in Mark Levin's lap. He said the president screamed at advisors who tried to tell him the truth. He said the man who had campaigned on America First was now groveling on live television to the interests that had purchased his foreign policy with $200 million in campaign contributions. These were not the words of a political opponent. They were the words of someone who had believed, who had built a career on that belief, who had told millions of people to trust the man now being described as compromised, manipulated, and dangerously disconnected from the reality of what his decisions were producing on the ground, in Iran, and at Dover Air Force Base, and at kitchen tables across America, where the gas prices and the grocery bills were climbing because the Strait of Hormuz was blocked, and no one in Washington had a plan to open it. The words landed differently because of who was saying them. An opponent's criticism can be dismissed. A loyalist's verdict cannot. And Alex Jones had delivered a verdict. This was not opposition. This was collapse. The loyalist architecture that had held for years, that had survived every scandal and every accusation and every moment where a different president would have been finished, was developing cracks that no amount of talking points could fill. Tucker Carlson had already gone. The man whose platform had been one of the most powerful amplifiers of the Trump message, who had sat across from the president and conducted the interviews that reached millions of people who trusted him above every other voice in conservative media. Gone. Not quietly. With the word disgusting attached to the war. With the implication that what was happening in Iran was not America first. It was something else. Something that benefited someone else, at the expense of the people who had believed the promise. And the promise had been specific. No more wars. The economy first. Inflation. Cost of living. The things that ordinary Americans felt every time they filled their gas tank or bought groceries or tried to calculate whether they could afford another month. Those were the promises that had moved the votes. Those were the commitments that had turned the election. And now the Strait of Hormuz was blocked. Oil prices were climbing, and the economic foundation that the administration had campaigned on was being undermined by the very conflict it had promised to avoid. 2/3 of Americans wanted out. Not victory, not the mission-accomplished moment that the speechwriters were preparing. Out. Even among Trump's own Republicans, 40% said end it now even if the goals are not achieved. 40% of the people who were still identifying as supporters of this administration were saying the cost was already too high. The families at Dover had not asked for more. The soldiers in the field had not signed up for this war. Joe Kent had not resigned from the counterterrorism directorship because he disagreed with a footnote in a policy document. He had resigned because he looked at what was happening and he recognized it. He had seen it before. In 11 combat tours. In a wife who did not come home. In the specific way that wars, that are not America's wars, get sold to Americans as something they cannot afford not to fight. He had seen it. He had said it. And the machine had called him weak. Donald Trump, the man who had appointed Joe Kent to protect the country from terrorism, looked into a camera and said that Joe Kent was not smart and had always been weak on security. The man with 11 combat tours, the gold star husband, weak on security, because he had read the intelligence and said what it showed. That is the moment the Loyalists saw. Not the approval ratings, not the poll numbers, not the historical comparisons to Nixon and Bush. They saw a president stand at Dover Air Force Base and tell grieving families their loved ones had asked for it. They saw a president call a decorated soldier weak for telling the truth. They saw the Strait of Hormuz stay blocked while oil prices climbed and the economic promises dissolved. And one by one, in different ways, with different words, they said it. Enough. The base did not abandon Donald Trump in a single dramatic moment. There was no speech, no press conference, no viral clip that marked the exact second it happened. It happened the way most things that matter happen. Quietly, incrementally, one person at a time, making a private calculation that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of walking away. The Loyalists had finally said enough, and the numbers, moving steadily downward from 93 to 76, from +6 to -18, were simply the arithmetic of that decision made visible. 13 soldiers are still at Dover. The Strait of Hormuz is still blocked. The war is still running. And the people who built the movement that made it all possible are standing outside looking in, trying to explain to themselves and to each other how they got here. The answer is not complicated. It never is. Someone made a promise. Someone broke it. And the people who believed it are left holding the cost. That is not a political story. That is the oldest story there is.